Welcome to The Language of Evidence. I'm your host, Alex Morozov. Today's episode will address several questions. Number one, what is the MAHA movement? We will get some insights from a recent MAHA Action press conference and get a sense of the death and suffering that may come from MAHA policies. We will resume where we left off in episode 1 for those of you who saw that or heard that episode, but if you did not, this episode is self-sufficient, so you don't have to go back. The second question is, what is the MAHA Commission? What are the influences from Project 2025 on it? And what is Project 2025 anyway? As we will discuss, Project 2025 is the latest edition of a decades-long conservative strategy spearheaded by the Heritage Foundation, which is a conservative think tank. But they're not the only influence on the MAHA Commission. There's also representation from the America First Policy Institute. So we'll talk about that. And how does Kennedy's MAHA fit into all of this? Were these conservative think tanks looking for Kennedy to be the Secretary of Health and Human Services, or were they as surprised as the rest of us? And finally, as the title suggests, we'll think about what happens if this MAHA Commission and Kennedy's MAHA agenda overall does not end well for patients, for science, and what are the implications of this for the conservative movement? And today, I'll tell you about my recent conversation with Ed Fuelner, the founder and CEO of the Heritage Foundation from 1979 to 2013. He still remains active on its board of trustees, recently met with President Trump. So he will shed some light on some of these questions. And basically, to reveal the punchline, the MAHA policies, many believe, will lead to death and suffering on an unprecedented scale. In fact, this has already started through gutting medical research institutions of funding and people, advocating against evidence-based interventions, undermining the medical establishment, frank scientific fraud, manufacture of evidence. A few days ago, the first child died of measles in the ongoing epidemic in West Texas. According to media reports, this is the first measles death in the U.S. in 10 years. And to this day, now several days after a child died, Kennedy did not come out asking people to get vaccinated. So if there was any doubt that he remains an anti-vaxxer, those doubts are now dispelled. So in a few years, the scientists will add up the numbers and will estimate the toll that MAHA policies took. And it will be a moment of reckoning. Who allowed this to happen? And the eyes will be on the Republican movement, the conservative movement, spearheaded by the Heritage Foundation for decades, and particularly the new conservative movement, an especially aggressive version started by Kevin Robbins, the new Heritage CEO since 2021. Interestingly, apart from other themes that we'll dissect later, a key theme for Robbins is a traditionalist focus on the family as a foundation of society. And by the way, we'll talk about the different factions within the conservative movement, traditionalist, libertarian, and corporatist, later on, as explained beautifully by Dr. Brian Conley, professor and chair of political science and legal studies at Suffolk University in Boston, in his recent lecture, The Origins and Evolution of Project 2025, that's available on YouTube. So Kevin Robbins, in his book, Dawn's Early Light, preaches family. He says, be fruitful and multiply. He wants to see many, many children in our country. But what happens if many of these children die as a result of MAHA? This could put an indelible stain on the conservative movement. We'll talk about Ed Fuelner's thoughts on this. And I will add, why are we talking about this on this podcast? Well, because evidence, medical evidence, is at the core of this issue. We will need to add up the numbers. Which interventions help? Which interventions hurt? This is very tricky and requires a good understanding of how evidence works. So, for example, if a child received a vaccine and then developed autism, that does not mean that the vaccine caused autism, and so on. Before we start, a couple of housekeeping notes and a little bit about myself. First of all, as in all of our episodes, this podcast will be available in 3 forms. Video, if you can watch, the link is in the description. Audio, if you prefer, and a transcript with links, if you prefer to read. As always, please subscribe, like, repost, forward. Our podcast is now on Audible, Spotify, and iHeartRadio, and soon to come to Apple Podcasts and other platforms. For those new to this podcast, a little bit about myself. I'm an oncologist, a former pharmaceutical executive turned writer. I'm working on a book with the same title, The Language of Evidence, and last year started a nonprofit, Aviva Partners, to promote better understanding of evidence. Our premise is that our understanding of how evidence works is very poor in our society and around the world. And this is part of the reason for our current crisis. And over the last few weeks, we have turned to activism. We assess that what is happening in the US is a revolt against science, medicine, and the media. So we launched MAHA Kills, hashtag MAHA Kills, a campaign to oppose this revolt. You can find out more at www.mahakills.org. There are links to follow us, and then you can also read about how exactly MAHA kills. Now, let's dive in. So the story starts at 4 in the afternoon, and this will be important later, on Thursday, February 13th. And that is when I walked in I arrived on the 11th floor of the National Press Center in Washington, D.C. to attend a press conference of the MAHA Alliance, which is the extra government arm of Kennedy's Make America Healthy Again movement. I was invited there by pure serendipity. The day before, on Wednesday, I learned that Kennedy's final Senate vote was scheduled for the following morning. Wednesday was also the day that the New York Times published an investigation into the web of Kennedy's friends who helped publish the latest vaccine cause autism study that he quoted with good effect in the hearings. I had collected a lot of material for that story, discovering the role of Andrew Wakefield in this manufacture of evidence. And this story was referenced in the New York Times article. So Wednesday night, I walked the halls of the Senate office buildings, somewhat naively thinking that I might run into some senators and tell them my story in case that could somehow impact the next day's vote. This idea of manufacturing evidence did not come up in the confirmation hearings, and I thought that would be a good line of questioning to bring up, but it was clearly too late. The only thing I accomplished was to get a pass to watch the historic vote from the Senate gallery, and incidentally, I got it from Mitch McConnell's office. That was the only office that was open. I spent the night brokenhearted watching the Democrats' desperate filibuster on C-SPAN as they repeated the same talking points that they already mentioned in Kennedy's confirmation hearings. On Thursday morning, I tried to get into the gallery at the Capitol, as anyone with a ticket can, to watch the final vote, the vote in person. But I was stopped because I had a bag with me and the coat check had not yet opened and bags were not allowed. So I got stuck. And next to me, there was a group of about a dozen well-dressed and cheerful people that had the same problem. I heard them say that they're going to leave the bags in their car. So I asked if they would take my bag too, and they enthusiastically agreed. So I asked, which organization are you from? And they said, MAHA. I said, the MAHA? Yes, they said, we are the MAHA. Check our new website, www.maha.io. And in fact, as I later learned, this organization, MAHA Alliance, owns the trademark for MAHA that they obtained from Kennedy. So I quickly opened maha.io before we had to turn in our phones, and I saw press conference today at 4 p.m. So I said, oh, you have a press conference. Can I join? They said, yes, absolutely. So here I am in this little small foyer at the National Press Club. The journalists are arriving. And I see two tall men chatting with each other. They were the center of attention. And had the camera and one of those fancy pole microphones pointed at them. And I recognized one of them. He was sitting with me at the. He was part of the group that I met in the Senate gallery. And the other one looked familiar, and then I realized it was Senator Ron Johnson, who, as I later learned, is a staunch supporter of Del Bigtree Kennedy and the MAHA movement. And I also noticed, it was kind of interesting, one of the reporters came up to them and Bigtree said, "Thank you for your balanced coverage." And Senator Johnson nodded and smiled. So we gradually piled into the room, and Senator Johnson was first to speak. And his remarks, as I explained in the first episode, echoed an event that he had organized on Capitol Hill in September 2024 called American Health and Nutrition, a Second Opinion. And I have the links to all of these in the transcript if any of you want to take a look. So at that event, which was held in the Senate office building right next to the Capitol. He was sitting next to Kennedy, flanked by Kayleigh and Casey Means, and Dr. Marty Makary, who was nominated later to be the head of the FDA. And Senator Johnson spoke at the time of the corruption and capture of government agencies, the media, medical journals, and the medical establishment by large corporate interests. And he repeated the same sentiment at the February 13th press conference. He offered effusive praise to Del Bigtree and then invited him to the podium. Del Bigtree came up to the podium. As he was talking, I slowly began to realize who he was. And what followed in this press conference was nothing short of a revolt against science, medicine, and the media. And I think you'll agree with me after you hear this podcast, this episode. And ominously, to this day, the press conference received almost no press coverage. So I asked one journalist, why is that? And they said, well, it didn't really make any news. Well, I will let you judge whether that's a reasonable assessment. So a little bit about Del Bigtree. He gained notoriety as the creator of a 2016 documentary called Vaxxed, along with Andrew Wakefield. And Andrew Wakefield is a British researcher who lost his medical license due to a now retracted Lancet study, which first postulated the vaccine autism link. And that is described in Brian Deere's book, The Doctor Who Fooled the World. That study was fraudulent, was retracted. But that was several years after it was published. But what happened immediately after it was published, many global health agencies sprung into action to look for this link, to confirm and refine this observation, including the CDC, of course. And in all cases, they found nothing. Which is not surprising because the study was fraudulent, so it's not surprising that nobody else could reproduce it. But some studies continue to come out, small studies, suggesting this link, including the one that Kennedy referred to in his confirmation hearings. Well, these studies continue to be manufactured by Kennedy's associates. As I outline in my article, and you can find it on thevivapartners.org. So this documentary, the 2016 documentary, attempts a kind of a comeback by arguing that the CDC did in fact find the link of vaccines and autism, but they buried it, citing a purported CDC whistleblower who had his phone calls secretly recorded by someone who then became a close associate of Kennedy and the leader of the anti-vax movement. And the actual whistleblower never actually came out and formally blew the whistle. Just recently watched this documentary, and it omits one critical point that Michael Hobbs astutely notes in the excellent episode of the podcast called Maintenance Phase from 2023. Okay, let's say the CDC did confirm Wakefield's study and indeed found that vaccines do cause autism and then buried this data because, I don't know, they were captured by pharma. But then why would other governments and researchers do the same? As Michael Hobbs says, why would the Health Ministry of Bangladesh be in on this conspiracy? What do they get from pharma? So then the news would be, every country finds that vaccines cause autism except the CDC. What's wrong with you, CDC? Did you cheat? Come out and explain yourself. But that's actually not what happened. More recently, Big Tree was in the news due to his provocative stunts at anti-vaccine rallies, as well as for spreading anti-vaccine propaganda among vulnerable communities such as Orthodox Jews. And in the media, it was reported that his anti-vaccine organization, Informed Consent Action Network, has enjoyed a pandemic windfall, bringing in millions of dollars. I have to say, Big Tree is an excellent speaker. He spoke for, I think, about an hour, with no notes, very eloquently, but in a kind of a disturbing way. His intensity provoked a visceral fear in me. His tone was at times soft, almost theatrical, but at times he would bellow at the reporters. And the message was clear. He's a friend of Kennedy's. He's an insider. He has a view of Kennedy's priorities and next steps, implying that MAHA Alliance is an extension of Kennedy's agenda. And most importantly, he says, we now have a truth teller in the administration. So you all, the press, better get in line. Let's watch and listen.
So what were you writing about? Where was your science, and exactly how do you call the people that got it right the spreaders of misinformation? You have been the spreaders of misinformation. You have gotten it wrong. And America is still waiting for an apology.
Yes.
Let me get back to that. You are a part of the greatest lie any modern society has ever told.
He yells, and the reporters, as you can see, are looking down.
They just got their HHS secretary. They just got their president. And you're going to have to think about what you do from here. What I'm going to do as Robert Kennedy Jr. brings the MAHA movement and idea into the regulatory agencies, as he starts doing the studies and science that we've been asking for decades. As he stops gaslighting people saying, we can't figure out what's causing autism. We're the greatest scientists in the world and the greatest nation in the world, but we can't figure out a problem that's gone from 1 in 10,000 to 1 in 34. Either someone's lying or someone needs to be fired. And that's about to start today.
You see how he anticipated massive layoffs in the various divisions of Health and Human Services that we saw over the last days and weeks, NIH, CDC, FDA. So he was clearly privy to Kennedy's plans. So worth listening to what else he mentioned might be in store.
A national database of all the practitioners that are going to heal you. Real health care, not sick care. We're going to create media to support everything that Robert Kennedy Jr. is doing, because you'll probably be mandated to scream bloody murder every time a transparent study comes out. But we'll be counteracting that with the truth tellers that got us to this place. We'll see if you start reporting now that we have a truth teller inside of government. And we'll see if you start reporting as you watch this movement in the hands of the people the MAHA movement, growing every single day. They're going to look for who's telling them the truth. They've seen who's lied to them. Maybe they can forgive you. I will if you start doing your job. Thank you.
I subsequently made a short video of the highlights that you can see the link in the transcript, and I shared it with my friends, colleagues, and the reaction was shock and disbelief. And what struck me the most, however, was the story of hepatitis B. If there was any doubt prior to Kennedy's confirmation that he would continue his war on vaccines, that doubt was dispelled by Bigtree in that press conference just hours after Kennedy was sworn in on that day. And by the way, that's what happened between his vote in the morning on February 13th and then the press conference at 4 p.m. In between, there was the swearing-in ceremony in the Oval Office, where Del Bigtree said he was present. Of course, we saw evidence of Kennedy's continued anti-vax attitude with the fact that he did not call for people to get vaccinated for measles in the middle of a measles epidemic that took the life of a child. But we had a clue from the MAHA press conference that, if reported, could have given us a heads up on what's to come. And what is the clue? Well, so as you'll see, Bigtree, the confidence of a medical school professor, he's lecturing us and telling us about the exchange between Senator Rand Paul and Senator Bill Cassidy in Kennedy's confirmation hearings. Let's watch and listen.
There's a very interesting conversation that happened during the hearings between Rand Paul and Senator Cassidy. Senator Cassidy brought up the importance of the hepatitis B vaccine, telling an anecdotal story about a young girl that he cared a lot about who was having liver failure. A tragic story, absolutely. But for Robert Kennedy Jr. and I and so many people in this room and thousands and thousands and thousands of parents, there is a story of a regression into autism, or of seizures, or of encephalitis, swelling of the brain in their babies after a vaccination, that apparently we're not supposed to care about that story. That Bobby Kennedy can't tell that story. That child doesn't matter. In the conversation, Rand Paul pointed out that hepatitis B is a sexually transmitted disease. The vaccine was developed for prostitutes and people that were having extreme sexual relations, or heroin addicts. And he said, I think that a parent should have a right to decide whether they vaccinate their one-day-old baby, which is when this vaccine is delivered all across America. You should be able to opt out of a hepatitis B vaccine, since it is unlikely in the near future for a day-one-old baby they will be having extreme sexual intercourse or sharing heroin needles. So what is the purpose? And of course, Senator Cassidy, and I'm very glad that he had as many deep conversations as he did with Robert Kennedy Jr., but right before our eyes we saw what conversation can happen when reasonable people start talking about an issue that they've never been allowed to talk about before. Senator Cassidy, in front of television all across the world, had to state, you know what? You're making a good point. It is a sexually transmitted disease, but in mothers that are hepatitis B positive, that vaccine is going to save that infant. Senator Rand Paul pointed out, rightfully so, that every mother in America is tested prior to delivering a baby. We know whether they are hepatitis B positive or not. So why is every woman being forced to give their baby a hepatitis B vaccine when we already know their status? And right there, in front of the world, Senator Cassidy said, you know what? Okay, I don't think a mother should be forced to take it if she's hepatitis B negative. We just watched the first transformation of a medical doctor in an important conversation, changing his mind based on the available science. That was he unaware of it prior to that conversation? I don't know. Or had he forgotten about that? I don't know. But what we did see is a mind being changed. And so when people say, is Robert Kennedy Jr. going to take a vaccine away? I would say Robert Kennedy Jr. is going to begin a conversation of transparency, of talking about the actual science that is written in every one of these lists, pages and pages.
So the sight of Big Tree in front of the national media arguing against universal day one Hep B vaccination made me shudder. Senator Cassie has been in the Senate for over 10 years, so I don't blame him for forgetting the reason why Hep B vaccination is recommended for all newborns, even when the mother is negative. And of course, Hep B is highly contagious, can be transmitted through contact with skin, if there are scratches or dermatitis without any visible blood, can survive on surfaces for over a week. Over 4% of Americans are infected with Hep B, much higher in certain communities, such as Asian communities. Anytime an infected person is close to an infant, there's a risk of infection. Could be a friend, family member, a healthcare provider. Even though all healthcare providers are vaccinated against Hep B, the efficacy is not always 100% of this vaccination. So if an infant gets infected, they have a 90% chance of becoming a chronic carrier and a 25% chance of dying of hepatitis B-induced cirrhosis or liver cancer, which would be usually decades later. And the WHO, in fact, has been spearheading a campaign to eliminate hepatitis B entirely through increased day one vaccination around the world. And Big Tree single-handedly undermined that whole effort right in front of my eyes. I witnessed the CEO of MAHA Alliance literally causing people to die. Not now, but decades later. The next morning, I learned about the swearing-in ceremony, Kennedy's swearing-in ceremony, and that during that ceremony, Trump signed an executive order to form the MAHA Commission. And this order says, among other things, autism spectrum disorders now affect 1 in 36 children in the United States, a staggering increase from rates of 1 to 4 out of 10,000 children during the 1980s. Yes, that is a staggering increase. And these statistics have been used as a rallying cry in the anti-vax community. Everyone repeats the same statistics, including Ron Johnson and others. Despite clear evidence, and I have the link to a recent article in JAMA, Journal of American Medical Association, that the vast majority of this increase, over 90-something percent, is due to improved diagnosis, universal screening, reduced stigma, and better availability of support services that are reimbursed by insurance, so providing a reason to make this specific diagnosis. And in fact, the autism community and the disability community as a whole has repeatedly come out against continued research into vaccine as a cause of autism. They issued a statement right around the time of Kennedy's confirmation. But the MAHA Commission was tasked with addressing this and other rising rates of chronic disease in children, proposing to look at a list of potential causes, which is a very bizarre list to me as a physician, and I'm sure many other physicians would agree. The American diet, absorption of toxic material, medical treatments as a cause of rising chronic disease, so that's odd, probably referring to the vaccines, lifestyle, environmental factors, government policies, food production techniques, electromagnetic radiation. This gets back to Kennedy's obsession with cell phones causing various ailments, including brain cancer, and corporate influence or cronyism. Corporate influence as a cause of chronic disease in children. But even more puzzling than the scientific question in front of this committee is the membership of the committee. And we'll spend the rest of the time talking about this. In fact, rather than the MAHA Commission, the more appropriate title would be the MAHA Project 2025 and the America First Policy Institute Commission. And as we'll talk about, Project 2025 is a publication by the Heritage Foundation, so we'll talk about that. In fact, the only person on this commission who represents MAHA or who has any connection to MAHA is Kennedy himself. And MAHA itself, even though the commission is named after it, is the most obscure healthcare policy of the three. The other two being Project 2025 and America First. MAHA is represented by Kennedy, the chair of the commission. Maybe a close ally would be David Weldon. Has not been associated with MAHA, but he was described in the media as Kennedy's anti-vaccine ally. And of course, vaccine safety has been a major pillar of MAHA. But not much is known about MAHA, generally speaking. The term appears to have been derived from the title of a 2020 book by Nicole Safier. Kennedy trademarked it, and as I mentioned, recently passed on the trademark to Big Tree's MAHA Alliance. Prior to Big Tree's diatribe, the most vivid description was provided by the Free Press, and they described MAHA as the coalition of nutritionists, shamans, and moms. If you try to search the scientific literature for MAHA, you will find practically nothing. Kennedy's campaign materials described alarmist statistics of increased chronic diseases, particularly autism, concerns for vaccine safety, environmental exposures to toxins. But there have been no detailed written platforms, a written document that existed prior to Trump's executive order. So the executive order establishing the MAHA Commission is in fact the first written description of MAHA itself. And curiously, the executive order does not mention vaccines at all, although it does ominously refer to ending federal practices that exacerbate the health crisis. And in fact, we don't even know how many people are in this MAHA movement. We know that it's described not just Kennedy's platform or strategy, but also a movement. In fact, Senator Johnson, in the February 13th press conference, described it as an enormous and growing movement. But I couldn't find any data to back this up. In fact, according to a recent New York Times opinion piece, the majority of U.S. voters, even Republicans, support vaccination, which is why maybe ultimately the decision was not to mention vaccination in the executive order. So that's MAHA. Then the second set of healthcare priorities on the MAHA Commission comes from an obscure organization called the America First Policy Institute, or AFPI, whose founder and CEO, Brooke Rollins, is on the commission by virtue of her role as Secretary of Agriculture. And another member of the MAHA Commission, Lee Zeldin, the head of EPA, was chair of AFPI's Pathway to 2025 initiative. Interestingly, Forbes reported in November that it was the AFPI rather than Project 2025 that was providing policy suggestions in support of Trump's presidential transition. AFPI's assessment of the state of healthcare in the US, if you look on their website, is quite different from what is described in the executive order. They do have a written platform of about a couple of dozen pages. They actually state that only half of Americans receive recommended care. And quality of care varies across conditions, demographic groups, and communities. So they're bringing up the idea of access to care as an issue and disparities, which I totally agree with. But that's not brought up at all by Kennedy. In fact, in a recent panel discussion that's posted on YouTube, the Honorable Bobby Jindal, the former governor of Louisiana, and who is the chair of AFPI's Center for a Healthy America, he described the U.S. as home to the greatest physicians and healthcare systems in the entire world. That's why people come here for care, he said. He cited rising costs, burdensome paperwork, and insurance coverage as key problems rather than poor outcomes. He said, if you are fortunate and have access to the best doctors, the best centers, your outcomes are as good as anywhere else in the world. So, consistent with this, AFPI healthcare policies are primarily focused on cost containment, reducing drug prices, controlling Medicare and Medicaid expenditures. The vaccines or other overtreatment themes of the executive order are not mentioned at all in their policy. So, being new to this, I wondered, so what? So there was an FBI. Now, two, CEO and its key executive are members of the MAHA Commission. So what? Now they're part of the government. So I talked to someone who's an advisor to AFPI, who's on the board of academic advisors. And they told me that, yes, AFPI is a relatively young think tank, but it has influence in the policy world, and the CEO is now a member of the administration. And so it is safe to say that AFPI policies will have a higher chance of being implemented. Okay, now, last but not least, several members of the MAHA Commission, assuming, of course, that they're all confirmed, have connections to the Heritage Foundation and its Project 2025. Russell Vogt, the head of the Office of Management and Budgets, is one of the key authors of Project 2025. Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, nominated as the head of NIH, has several connections to conservative think tanks, most notably the American Institute for Economic Research, AIER, located in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, and particularly Jeffrey Tucker, who was at AIER at the time, was the originator and the sponsor of the Great Barrington Declaration, for which Bhattacharya is well known, that I describe as let's go out and get COVID and whoever survives will be immune strategy. Jeffrey Tucker then went on to found Brownstone Institute. He became famous as a result of the Great Barrington Declaration, which went viral. And the Brownstone Institute is is listed among the many organizations that are listed as advisors to Project 2025. And another connection is that William Ruger, the president of AIER, American Institute of Economic Research, is listed as an author of Project 2025 and spent years working at the Charles Koch Foundation. And the Koch family is a major supporter of the Heritage Foundation. I'll mention this a little bit later. And interestingly, it's not just Bhattacharya himself, but in fact, Stanford, as an organization, has had a history of associations with conservative think tanks. Dr. Marty Makary is connected to two conservative think tanks. One is the Claremont Institute, and one is the Paragon Institute, both on Project 2025's advisory board. And then Stephen Miller. We know him well from Trump's first term, Trump's deputy chief of staff for policy, now in the current administration. He was the CEO and founder of America First Legal Foundation, which also is an advisor to Project 2025. So many people, several people on the MAHA Commission have direct connections to Project 2025. And as we'll talk later, this is not a coincidence. So what is this idea of think tanks? What are think tanks? And what is this idea that they're helping with presidential transitions? Well, in fact, this is not new. And the idea is that the president comes in, they're newly elected, they don't have all the history, they don't know where they're supposed to start, what the priorities are. They were just busy with campaigning and etc. So a think tank will help them. And in fact, Democrats were first. With the Brookings Institution, going back to 1916. And for example, John F. Kennedy had about 100 Brookings scholars working on policy directly in support of the president. But on the conservative side, there was a gap. And a lot of this material that I'll mention comes from this nice book, which is really a biography of Ed Fuelner, and the person I spoke to, by Lee Edward, his biographer. So a fascinating read. So Lee Edward talks about this idea that, as Ed Fuelner recalled, the left had a finely tuned policy-making machine, and the right had nothing to match it. The goal was to conduct policy research. That's what these organizations do. So they're different from academia in that sense. So academia may come up with some theoretical ideas, economists, etc. But then Lee Edward talks about this alchemy that happens when the experts, whether it's Brookings or Heritage, they take that academic theoretical plan and convert that into a legislative proposal. So that's the idea. And over the decades, since its founding in 1979 by Ed Fuelner, who then became its first CEO, the Heritage Foundation grew now into the largest think tank in the US. It has about $100 million annual budget. The Heritage Foundation itself is a 501c3 organization, so it is shielded from reporting requirements. So we actually don't know who the funders are, but it does have a lobbying arm. And it also has hundreds of researchers on staff and hundreds of thousands of paying members who are described as a national movement. They don't just pay dues, but they are involved in activism. They write to Congress, members of Congress. And then in addition, Heritage also maintains what is known as a resource bank to, quote, identify conservative policy experts on and off the campus and connect them to the Washington policy community, end quote. So in addition to these members who are the small donors, there are also big donors. We don't know, as I mentioned, exactly who they are, but they're thought clearly to include industry influences. And this goes back to the original founding grant when Heritage was formed. It came from Joseph Coors, the beer magnate of Coors Beer. And big conservative donors such as the Koch family and Scafee family are behind it as well. And this is outlined in Jane Mayer's book, Dark Money. And there's an interesting quote I'll read, which will be important later, so we understand what is the main crux of the Heritage Foundation policy. While those attracted to Koch's meetings were uniformly conservative, so she's describing these secret meetings that the Koch family started organizing around the time Obama was elected to kind of develop the counter strategy. While they were uniformly conservative, they often disagreed among themselves about social and international issues. The glue that bound them together, however, was antipathy towards government regulation and taxation, particularly as it impinged on their own accumulation of wealth. So, to get back to Project 2025, in 1981, the Heritage Foundation released a unique document, unprecedented in national policymaking. In fact, they leapfrogged over Brookings. Brookings was helping with transitions, but apparently they never put this together as like a giant guide book for the new administration, the way the Heritage Foundation did. It was called the Mandates for Leadership, and was designed at the time as a guide for the next Republican president, at that time, Ronald Reagan. And so you'll see in this biography, Ed Fuelner's biography, on the cover is his picture with Ronald Reagan. And since then, there have been 9 editions. So Project 25 is the 9th edition of the Mandates for Leadership. And you can see over the decades the evolving ideology. And there's a great lecture online on YouTube by Dr. Brian Conley, the chair of political science and legal studies at Suffolk University in Boston. And he was very generous with his time as well. And we had a long discussion, and I used him as a sounding board for what I'm describing here. He describes three factions of the conservative movement. Number one is libertarians, the idea of limited or no state. Traditionalists promoting family, religious life, moral state. That's where this extreme opposition to abortion, LGBTQ+, transgender, etc., all of that is a traditionalist ideology. And then the third one is corporatist, promoting a free market, corporate power, and the pro-business regulatory state. So that echoes the quote from Jane Mayer's book that I just mentioned. And so what Conley says is that this the first 1981 edition of Mandates for Leadership, to use his words, heavily, disproportionately, almost exclusively, overwhelmingly favors a corporate perspective, a corporatist perspective, he says. Its primary function was to combat, counter, capture, and remake the regulatory state. It outlines how the executive branch could be remade to promote and protect business interests. And he mentions throughout the lecture that essentially this remains the main thread in the Heritage Foundation strategy, including in Project 2025. So how to accomplish this? Well, so that goes back to this idea that goes back to the 80s, that personnel is policy. And this was something that was covered recently in ProPublica. The power flows from having the right people in the right jobs. And Conley quotes from the first edition of Mandates for Leadership: act promptly to fill vacancies and find persons of high quality and friendly persuasion. And this is still an extremely important aspect of the Heritage Foundation's work. So in addition to the large book called Project 2025 that is available online, there is also a database of around 20,000 potential administration officials created. This was an enormous effort, cost $22 million. These are vetted operatives that are loyal, or, as it says, have a friendly persuasion. And as the New York Times noted recently, Heritage usually compiles its own personnel lists and spends far less doing so. But for this election, after conservatives and Mr. Trump himself decried what they viewed as terrible staffing decisions made during his first administration, more than 50 conservative groups have temporarily set aside rivalries to team up with Heritage on this project. That's why a $22 million project, to build a database, vet people. So it is therefore no surprise that Trump tapped many key Project 2025 players for key positions in the new administration. This is the personnel and policy in action, and this has been widely reported. So it's no accident that these people are on the MAHA commission. There's one complication of this corporatist pro-business policy that Conley talks about. How do you communicate the pro-business message to the public? It's not very popular. So Conley says in his lecture towards the end, for politics in the US to be successful, it has to become majoritarian. It has to appear like it has a broad base of support in the public. That was always a challenge for the business community. How do we create a majoritarian state when we represent a very, very small percentage of the people? And the way to do it is to say, we are not the threat. The government is the threat. So now turning to the healthcare policy, what is the Heritage Foundation healthcare policy? And how might it influence the MAHA Commission through its Heritage connected members? Miller, Vogt, Makary, Bhattacharya. And it's interesting to trace the evolution of the healthcare policy across decades. I couldn't find the 1981 edition, but I found the 1989 or 88. That's available on Internet Archive. 2016 is also available. The 2020 I got online. It was the only way to get it. Clearly, not a lot of people are interested in tracing these sequentially. And of course, Project 2025 is easy to find online. So Project 2025, in assessing the state of health in the US today, strikes an alarmist tone that is very similar to MAHA talking points rather than AFPI. And for example, one quote is, as a result of HHS's having the Department of Health and Human Services having lost its way, US life expectancy, instead of returning to normal after the COVID-19 pandemic, continued to drop precipitously to levels not seen since 1996. With white populations alone losing 7% of their expected lifespan in just 1 year. I don't know why white populations. It's a very odd way to put it. And then there are traditionalist themes. These are, of course, present as expected for any conservative agenda. Anti-abortion, anti-gay marriage, anti-transgender. And in fact, this sometimes borders on comical. There's one quote, homes with non-related boyfriends present are among the most dangerous places for a child to be. But all jokes aside, the language has become more extreme if you compare even to the 2020 version. 2016 just meekly states providers and organizations should not be required to offer services such as abortion that violate their conscience. That's all. And same in 2020. But Project 2025 takes a much more aggressive stance. Calls for withdrawal of mifepristone from the market and policing of the CDC, by the CDC, of abortions in blue states and reporting, among other measures. So then there are libertarian anti-lockdown themes that make their first appearance post-COVID in Project 2025. It says, never again should public health bureaucrats be allowed to hide information, ignore information, or mislead the public concerning the efficacy or dangers associated with any recommended health interventions, because they believe it may lead to hesitancy on the part of the public, the document states. It demands to severely confine the CDC's ability to make policy recommendations and to investigate, expose, and remediate any instances in which HHS violated people's rights by colluding with big tech to censor dissenting opinions during COVID. And of course, we know which dissenting opinions they're talking about. Ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, the Great Barrington Declaration. So, and then there's another libertarian theme, which is anti-elitism. And Russell Vogt, in his Project 2025 chapter, attacks the pervasive notion of expert independence that protects so-called expert authorities from scrutiny. And Makary and Bhattacharya would agree. They have both come out strongly against the medical establishment. And in fact, their colleague on this editorial board of a new anti-establishment journal said that traditional medical journals are dead. So now in terms of corporatists, if you look at it on the surface, there are some prominent anti-corporate themes. And these are echoed by Big Tree, Senator Ron Johnson, Makary, Bhattacharya, talking of conflict of interest, pharmaceutical companies capturing the agencies that regulate them. But behind the veneer of anti-industry messaging is a pervasive pro-business agenda. So, for example, requiring efficacy trials of new applications for generic drugs. That's a windfall for pharma. There's no mention of drug prices being an issue. So no wonder, as reported in the media, pharma has been quiet, have not lobbied against MAHA. So overall, Project 2025 has taken a much more extreme, darker, combative stance than the 2016 and the 2020 version. And the reason is clear. Kevin Roberts took the helm in 2021. His recent book, Dawn's Early Light, with a foreword by J.D. Vance, calls for a second American Revolution, a crusade to take back our country by what he describes as the new conservative movement against the coastal elites who are committing a conspiracy against the American people. It's a scary book, and I encourage everyone to take a look at it. For example, one quote I found scary: "Armed American patriots, protective of their rights, exert an influence on our government just by existing, even without needing to mount an armed resistance. By raising the potential cost of any government intervention, the Second Amendment creates a structural restraint on the growth of tyranny within our borders. We can attribute the freedoms we maintained during COVID to the Second Amendment." How scary is that? Basically, we have a bunch of armed people, so if the government gets out of line, they will take care of things. So this is someone who's now in charge of the Heritage Foundation, and in fact, our vice president wrote a foreword to this book. So getting back now for our final question, how will all of this mix of strategies, ideologies, agendas play out on the MAHA Commission? So we have Kennedy's MAHA and vaccine skepticism, concerns about over-medication as a cause of disease, and then the FBI, the other way around with Access and the Heritage Foundation with its pro-business and traditionalist and libertarian threads. In fact, the Heritage Foundation does not, Project 25 does not have anything against vaccines. In fact, the other way around. They raise a concern that thousands of Americans of faith and conscience wish to receive various childhood vaccinations for themselves and their families, but are not allowed to receive vaccines that are derived through or tested on aborted fetal cells. There are ethically derived alternatives abroad that have been used safely there for decades, but the FDA makes it exceedingly difficult for Americans to import them. So they're actually trying to make sure that their conservative followers, communities, can get access to vaccines that are not made using fetal cells. And then AFPI equally actually says the opposite about lack of access. So that gets us to this basic contradiction. So Robbins, in Dawn's Early Light, he paints a vision for the country which is very much centered around family, as I mentioned. A bright American tomorrow, one full of children. A culture of children is a culture of hope, he says. The more children we have, the more young people we will have to help solve problems of tomorrow. But there's a real possibility that Kennedy's MAHA platform could interfere with this vision, leading to massive death and suffering in this country. And we already talked about one example of this, speaking out against Hep B vaccination of newborns. Halting the flu vaccine campaign, delaying vaccine-related advisory boards and meetings, and ongoing measles epidemic without Kennedy coming out to tell people to get vaccinated. And as we talked about some of the ways that the MAHA agenda could lead to worsening health outcomes. So I spoke about this with Ed Fuelner himself. He was kind enough to talk to me. And he said that he is very certain that until President Trump decided that Kennedy would be his nominee for Health and Human Services, when they decided to join forces in August of last year, he said, we, meaning the Heritage Foundation, had not had much to do with him. In fact, he told me that Mitch McConnell has been a good friend of his for a very long time, over 30 years. He said, he's my age. For him to suffer polio the way he did at the very early age, and for somebody else to say that the polio vaccine doesn't work, well, if I were Mitch McConnell, I would be pissed off about that too, is what he said. And of course, he's referring to the story that Mitch McConnell ended up the only Republican who voted against Kennedy's confirmation as the Secretary of Health and Human Services, as a polio survivor. And then Trump said something to the effect of, well, maybe he didn't have polio, or putting down the polio vaccine. It's clear that there was no love between the Heritage Foundation and Kennedy. So then I asked him, if he has this concern, and other folks at the Heritage Foundation, that here's a moment in history when there's an opportunity for this new conservative movement to finally achieve its agenda. Again, I'm not passing any judgment on the agenda, but I'm asking him, the founder of the Heritage Foundation, is there a concern that it could be marred or stained as a result of the botched execution by Robert F. Kennedy Jr., telling people to stop taking vaccines, medications, not trusting doctors? People will die, I said. Well, he said, but people are dying already because of obesity or red dye. Okay, I did not fact check this. I'm not sure that anybody died as a result of red dye. But he's saying, well, Kennedy has been outspoken of those things, about those things, he said. And I don't know what the media is going to say. I'm not going to anticipate what the media is going to say. And he said, I was at a conference earlier that day, apparently, when we spoke. This was about a week ago, 2 weeks ago. And I said, I've been around Washington long enough to know there are no permanent defeats. But again, there are no permanent victories either, just permanent battles. And every battle has to be fought in terms of the principles we believe in. In fact, this quote is in Lee Edwards' book. But then I said, well, but see, I told him about my career in the pharmaceutical industry, overseeing hundreds of clinical trials in oncology. And I said, I'm used to thinking about evidence, and it will not be political at the end of the day. Scientists will review the data, they will add up the outcomes, and I worry that outcomes will be worse as a result of Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s agenda. I might add as a side note that, especially now, the way we're capturing data in our health systems, it will not be difficult. With all of the latest approaches to how to collecting and analyzing real-world data, deriving insights, causality, artificial intelligence, this will not be difficult to assess the damage that was caused by the MAHA policies. That's as an aside. But basically, I said that I worry that this will put a stain on the conservative movement. So he said that he hopes not, but he said, we agree. I agree with you. Evidence is black and white. You don't change the evidence to fit your theory. And then I told him about the day one Hep B vaccination and what I heard in the MAHA press conference and Big Tree's fear-mongering that may cause deaths decades later. And he said, "You're absolutely right. The vaccines that have gone through appropriate clinical trials, well, it's like polio and McConnell," he said. So here we are. We can now see all the competing political interests on the MAHA Commission. My conclusion is that it's not really about the science. It's about promoting a pro-business agenda masquerading as a populist agenda. We're focusing on the wrong things, not the disparities, not the drug prices. That would be really helpful, but vaccines, which are not commercially viable anyway for pharma. So pharma will not object to this. They will just quietly drop the vaccines. And the focus on dismantling regulatory agencies like the FDA, the CDC, creating this narrative that they're captured by pharma and we need to dismantle them. But actually, who is helped by dismantling these agencies? Pharma. They're probably happy. They're quiet. They're not lobbying against this. We saw Albert Bourla complimenting Trump. And finally, we got the answer to the original question. No, the Heritage Foundation did not plan for Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to be in charge of healthcare. And I'm sure they are worried about MAHA putting an indelible stain. And Ed Fuelner agreed ultimately that evidence is black and white, and time will tell. This has been The Language of Evidence with your host, Alex Morozov. Don't forget to subscribe, repost, and forward, and stay tuned for the next episode. This week we have Bhattacharya's and Makari's confirmation hearings on Wednesday, March 5th at 10 a.m., Thursday, March 6th at 10 a.m. respectively. You can watch them live on C-SPAN, and we will be live tweeting at Alex Morozov NYC.